Snow fell in thick, unforgiving sheets as Silas Thornton drove the shovel into the frozen ground. Each strike sent pain shooting through his arms, but he welcomed it. Physical agony was a merciful distraction from the hollowness in his chest. Two wooden coffins lay beside him, one large, one small, both crude, both fashioned by his own hands in the dark hours of the night. The wind howled across the hilltop, stealing his breath, freezing the tears on his weathered face. He hadn't slept in 3 days, hadn't eaten, couldn't remember when he last spoke a word aloud. When both graves were finally deep enough, Silas gently lowered the smaller coffin first. His hands trembled as they released his daughter's tiny form to the earth. Grace, he whispered, the name itself a prayer. Next came Eleanor's coffin, his wife of 7 years, the woman whose laugh had made their small cabin feel like a palace, whose strength had given him purpose, whose absence now made the world unbearable. Kneeling in the snow between the graves, Silas pressed his forehead against the cold wood of Eleanor's coffin. The storm raged around him, but he felt nothing. Eleanor, little Grace, his voice cracked. I swear on everything I am, I will never let anyone into my heart again. He placed a trembling hand on each coffin. Love only brings suffering. I've learned that now. Later, he erected 2 simple wooden markers. On Eleanor's, he carved, Eleanor Thornton, beloved wife, December 20th, 1881. On the smaller one, Grace Thornton, angel returned to heaven, December 20th, 1881. As night fell over Evergreen Valley, Silas stood alone on the hilltop, a solitary figure against the endless white. Below his cabin sat dark and empty, a hollow shell like the man who owned it. 3 years passed. The seasons changed, the land endured, and Silas Thornton existed, though few would call it living. December 1884 brought another merciless blizzard to Evergreen Valley. The wind screamed past his cabin windows as Silas bolted awake, his nightshirt soaked with sweat despite the bitter cold. Another nightmare. Always the same, Eleanor calling his name. The sound of her labored breathing. Grace never crying. The silence that told him everything before the midwife even spoke. Should have been there, he muttered, rising to stoke the dying fire. Should have been me instead. His cabin was simple now. 10 acres remained of what had once been a thriving 100-acre ranch. The rest sold to pay debts after Eleanor and Grace died. What hadn't been sold had been claimed by the bank. What remained was enough for one man who didn't care much about living anyway. Silas pulled on his coat and boots. No sense trying to sleep now. Might as well check the train station. The monthly supply shipment was 3 days late. Not that he expected it would arrive in this weather, but the walk would tire him enough to perhaps grant a few hours of dreamless sleep. The 2-mile journey to Evergreen Station was brutal. Snow had drifted waist-high in places, and the wind cut through his clothes like knives. By the time the station's single oil lamp came into view, Silas could barely feel his fingers. As expected, the platform stood empty. The station master had long since locked up and headed home. No supplies today. Another broken promise in a long line of them. Silas turned to leave when something caught his eye. A dark shape slumped against the bench at the far end of the platform. Probably a bundle of cargo forgotten in haste. But cargo didn't wear a nurse's uniform. A woman sat there. Unconscious, her skin blue with cold. Blood stained her white apron. One hand clutched a leather medical bag like it was her last tether to life. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Silas approached cautiously. Ma'am? No response. He crouched beside her, noticing frost crystals forming in her dark hair. She couldn't have been there long, or she'd already be dead. Must have arrived on the afternoon train, gotten stranded when no one met her. The rational part of Silas's mind tallied his resources. Wood enough for perhaps a week if he was careful. Food for 2 weeks if he ate sparingly. Taking in this stranger might cost him everything. But leaving her meant certain death. His father's words echoed in his memory. A man is measured by what he does when nobody's watching. Silas sighed, breath clouding the frozen air. He removed his coat and wrapped it around the woman's thin frame. She was lighter than she should have been as he lifted her onto his horse. Her medical bag he carefully tied beside her. Don't know who you are, stranger, he said to her unhearing ears, but dying alone ain't right for anybody. You hold on, you hear? Mounting behind her, he cradled her against his chest to share what warmth he had. As they rode into the gathering darkness, snow began falling harder, erasing their tracks almost immediately. The station lamp grew smaller behind them until it disappeared altogether. "God help us both," Silas muttered, feeling the woman's faint heartbeat against his arm. For now, that was enough. The cabin door banged open as Silas carried the unconscious woman inside. The interior felt almost as cold as outside. He placed her gently on his bed, then hurried to build a fire, his fingers clumsy with cold. "Come on," he muttered, striking flint against steel. Sparks flew, caught the kindling. He bent low, blowing carefully until flames flickered to life. The woman moaned softly as warmth gradually filled the cabin. Steam rose from her damp clothes. Silas hesitated, then moved to remove her frozen outer garments. He worked clinically, keeping her covered with his only quilt. Her skin felt like ice beneath his calloused hands. For 3 days, fever ravaged her body. She thrashed in delirium, calling out names Silas didn't recognize. "Rebecca!" she cried repeatedly. "I couldn't save both of you." Silas forced thin broth between her cracked lips, kept the fire burning, slept sitting upright in his wooden chair, jerking awake hourly to check her breathing. His own meals became smaller, rationing what little he had. On the morning of the 4th day, her eyes finally opened, deep brown and immediately filled with terror. She tried to sit up, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings, the rough-hewn furniture, the leaking roof, the 2 framed photographs on the mantel. "Where am I? Who are you?" Panic edged her voice. She clutched the quilt tighter around herself. Silas backed away, hands raised peacefully. "You're safe, ma'am. Found you nearly frozen to death at the station." "I'm Silas Thornton. This is my land." She stared at him, breathing hard, deciding whether to trust. Her gaze fell on the medical bag sitting carefully beside the bed. "My bag." "Didn't touch nothing inside," Silas said quickly. "Figured it was important to you." Some of the fear left her face. She slumped back against the thin pillow, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm Abigail Foster." Silas nodded once, moved to add another log to the fire. "Miss Foster, just Abigail, please." He kept his back to her, uncomfortable with the intimacy of her first name. "You were bad off. Frostbite on your fingers, fever for 3 days. He gestured vaguely toward her bandaged hands. "Used what I had, not much." Abigail looked down at her hands, wrapped in torn but clean cloth. Her gaze drifted to the photographs on the mantel, a young woman holding an infant, both smiling. Dust covered the frame. "Your family?" she asked quietly. "Was." The single word carried 3 years of grief. Abigail nodded, understanding without asking. Loss recognized loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Silas turned from the fire, his expression guarded. "No need." He cleared his throat. "But I got to be straight with you. I've got food for maybe 2 weeks if we're careful. Winter don't care about our plans. You bend or you break." Abigail sat up slowly, wincing. "Then I won't be a burden long." Her voice strengthened. "I'm a nurse, a real one. I can earn my keep as soon as I'm able." Something shifted in Silas's expression, not quite hope, but an easing of tension. "We'll figure it out," he said. "For now, you rest." But Abigail was already looking past him, out the window, where a simple wooden cross stood visible against the snow. Her eyes softened with compassion. "I truly am sorry for the trouble," she whispered. "No trouble," Silas replied, the words feeling strange in his mouth after years of solitude. "Just 2 people trying to get through winter." Outside, the wind continued its mournful howl. Inside, the fire crackled steadily. For the first time in years, Silas's cabin held something besides grief. Morning light turned the snow-covered hills silver. Abigail stood at the window, staring at the grave markers, wrapped in Eleanor's old shawl that Silas had silently offered. Silas entered with an armload of firewood, followed her gaze, and said nothing. Over breakfast, thin porridge stretched with water, the truth emerged in careful pieces. "I'm from Philadelphia," Abigail said, hands wrapped around a chipped cup for warmth. "I worked at Mercy Hospital for 5 years." Silas listened, spooning his porridge slowly, eyes downcast. "Last September, Judge Sullivan was brought in. Stroke, severe, likely fatal. But at the same time, his housekeeper's daughter came down with a pneumonia. 7 years old, completely treatable if caught early. Her voice steadied, rehearsing a story she'd told herself 1,000 times. They called me for the judge. I went to the child first. The judge was already critical. Nothing I could do would change that. But the girl, Rebecca, she could live. What happened? Silas asked, meeting her eyes for the first time. I saved Rebecca. The judge died while I was treating her. Abigail's hands tightened around the cup. His family said I chose wrong, that I murdered their patriarch by choosing a nobody over a somebody. They destroyed my career, made sure no hospital in Philadelphia would hire me. So I left. She looked directly at Silas. I came west because there was nowhere else to go. That's who you saved. A disgraced nurse running from her past. Silas set down his spoon. He rolled his left shoulder, a movement Abigail immediately noticed with a trained eye. 3 winters passed, he said slowly. I lost my wife, Eleanor, and our baby girl. I was away buying horses, trying to build up the ranch. Make something for us. His voice roughened. Eleanor went into labor early. By the time I got back, he didn't finish. Didn't need to. Couldn't afford a doctor, he continued, staring into his bowl. Couldn't afford lots of things. Lost most of the ranch paying debts. This cabin and 10 acres is all that's left. Abigail watched him carefully. Your shoulder, that's an old break, isn't it? Healed wrong. Silas looked surprised. Last summer, horse threw me. Never set right. I can help with that, Abigail said. And I can earn my keep if you'll let me stay through winter. Split whatever I earn. Silas studied her. Town will talk. A widower and an unmarried woman under one roof. Let them talk. Abigail's chin lifted slightly. I've endured worse. Might not be that simple. But Olivia Blackwood, my nearest neighbor, she's good people. Sharp-tongued but fair. If she approves, others might follow. Abigail extended her bandaged hand across the rough table. I won't be charity, Mr. Thornton. Silas, he corrected. And it ain't charity if you're working. He shook her hand carefully, calloused palm against her softer one. A horse knows a hard man from a kind one, Abigail said quietly. So do I. Later that afternoon, while helping Silas arrange sleeping quarters, he insisted she keep the bed while he would sleep on a pallet near the fire. Abigail discovered a folded paper tucked beneath the mattress. As she pulled the blanket taut, the letter fell to the floor. I'm sorry, she said, quickly bending to retrieve it, but not before seeing it was addressed, My dearest Silas, in a flowing feminine hand. The envelope was unsealed, the letter clearly read many times. Abigail handed it back without looking at its contents, but not before noticing the signature at the bottom. Forever yours, Eleanor. Something in Silas's expression stopped her from asking. The letter trembled slightly in his weathered hand before he carefully tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. She wrote it, he said finally, voice rough, the day before she died. Found it after, he cleared his throat. Never meant for me to read it while she was gone. Abigail nodded, respecting his privacy. But that evening, as Silas tended the horses in the small barn, she couldn't help wondering what final words Eleanor had left for her husband. Words he carried next to his skin, but that seemed to bring more pain than comfort. The following morning, Olivia Blackwood arrived unexpectedly, a sturdy woman in her 60s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Without knocking, she pushed open the cabin door, a basket of preserves in her arms. So you're the frozen nurse Silas pulled from certain death, she announced, looking Abigail up and down like she was evaluating livestock. Half the valley's talking about it already. Abigail, in the midst of changing her own bandages, met the older woman's gaze steadily. I suppose I am. Olivia, Silas nodded in greeting, emerging from the back room. Didn't expect you in this weather. Storms let up enough, figured I'd better see this miracle for myself before rumors grow wilder. She set down her basket on the table. Brought some preserves, figured you'd be running low on provisions. Much appreciated, Silas said quietly. Olivia turned back to Abigail. Silas says you're staying. If he'll have me, Abigail replied evenly. The older woman narrowed her eyes. Town won't like this, Emmett Crawford especially. The banker? Abigail asked. The vulture, Olivia corrected. Been after Silas's land for years. He'll use any excuse. Silas shifted uncomfortably. I know. Olivia studied Abigail for a long moment. Girl's got purpose in her eyes, she finally declared. That's more than most folks got. She turned to Silas. You're a grown man. Your choice who stays under your roof, but be ready. Crawford won't let this pass without causing trouble. After Olivia left, Abigail found Sarah's sewing kit in a drawer. Without asking permission, she began mending Silas's torn shirt with careful, precise stitches. Silas watched from the doorway, something cracking in his chest at the sight of someone caring for his things, his home. For 3 years, he'd existed in suspended animation, not living, merely surviving. Now this stranger was threading life back into the frozen tableau of his existence. Thank you, he said quietly. Abigail looked up, offered a small smile. Just earning my keep. But they both knew it was more than that. Something was beginning here. Something neither quite understood yet. Outside, the first evening star appeared in the clearing sky. Inside, 2 broken people sat in comfortable silence, mending what could be mended. January brought routine and rhythm to the cabin. Each morning, Abigail worked on Silas's shoulder, kneading and manipulating the joint carefully, coaxing it back toward proper alignment. Silas gritted his teeth through the pain, but within 2 weeks, his range of motion improved noticeably. How did you know what to do? He asked one morning as she wrapped his shoulder after a particularly effective session. Abigail's hands stilled momentarily. My father was a doctor. Before he fell on hard times, he taught me what he could. He must have been proud, having a daughter become a nurse. A shadow crossed her face. He died before I completed my training. Pneumonia. We couldn't afford proper care by then. Silas nodded, understanding the cruel irony, a healer's family unable to access healing. That why you chose the little girl over the judge? He asked quietly. Abigail's eyes widened slightly at his insight. Perhaps. I never thought of it that way. She resumed wrapping his shoulder. I just knew what was right. Word spread cautiously through the valley. Olivia mentioned the nurse at Thornton's place to a desperate mother whose son struggled to breathe. The woman arrived at dawn, terrified, carrying a gasping child. Abigail worked quickly, steam tent, herbal poultices, keeping the boy upright through the worst hours. By evening, his breathing eased. By morning, the crisis had passed. The mother paid with a basket of eggs and tearful gratitude. More came after that. Farmers too proud to see the town doctor. Ranchers too poor to afford his fees. A pregnant woman worried about bleeding. An old man with a wound that wouldn't heal. Abigail treated them all, accepting whatever they could offer. Flour, preserved vegetables, a repaired harness, fresh milk. Silas built her a small examination area in the corner of the cabin. Clean, organized, respectful of her profession. They developed rhythms together. Silas taught Abigail to split wood properly, angle the ass, let gravity do the work. She showed him how to clean wounds without whiskey. Boiled water and clean cloth worked better and hurt less. They worked side by side repairing the leaking roof. Silas on the ladder, Abigail handing up shingles. Both laughing when she made a joke about his carpentry skills. I can fix bones, she said. You fix roofs. We each got our talents. Neighbors might talk, Silas replied, hammering a nail home. But they remember who helps when the chips are down. Christmas Eve arrived quiet and cold. They shared simple stew by firelight, neither mentioning the significance of the date. Though Abigail had noticed Silas visited the hillside graves that morning, standing silent in the snow for nearly an hour. After dinner, Silas disappeared into the bedroom, returning with a small wrapped bundle. These were Eleanor's, he said, handing Abigail a pair of winter gloves. Fine leather, lovingly maintained. She'd want them used, not locked away. Abigail's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd allowed since Philadelphia. Silas, I can't. You can. You should. His voice was gentle but firm. She tried them on. Perfect fit. Looking at him across the firelight, this good man who'd saved her life and asked nothing in return, something shifted in her heart. You've done more good in 2 months than most do in 2 years, Silas said quietly. You saved my life too, in a way. I'm just returning the favor. Feels like more than that. The words hung in the warm air between them, neither quite brave enough to name what was growing, but both feeling it. Steady, undeniable, real. That night, Silas slept in the barn, as he had every night since Abigail's arrival, maintaining propriety. But he lay awake in the hay, watching the lamplight glow from the cabin window. Inside, Abigail stood at that window, looking toward the barn, one hand pressed against the cold glass. Eleanor's gloves warmed her hands, but something else entirely warmed her heart. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. Both were learning that truth together. The blizzard hit on the third night of January, sudden, vicious, screaming wind that turned day to night. For 4 days they were trapped inside, snow piled against the door waist high. The world disappeared into white chaos. Only the cabin existed, firelight in forced proximity and nowhere to hide. The first day passed in practical tasks, rationing food, keeping the fire fed, melting snow for water. They worked together efficiently, speaking only what was necessary. The second day brought conversation. Abigail read aloud from Silas's only book, the Bible, while he whittled a small horse figurine, letting wood shavings fall into the fire. The silence between words grew comfortable instead of awkward. The third morning, Abigail spoke the full truth. Judge Sullivan was dying anyway, she said, staring into the flames. His stroke was catastrophic. He had hours at most, and those would have been agony. She swallowed hard. Rebecca had pneumonia, but it was early, completely treatable. She was 7 years old with her whole life ahead. Silas's hands stilled on the wood. You knew what they'd say. You knew what it would cost you. I did. Her voice cracked, but I made my choice, and they called me a murderer anyway. Said I let a somebody die to save a nobody. Silas moved to sit beside her on the floor by the fire. I made the wrong choice too, he said quietly. Abigail looked at him questioningly. I was buying breeding horses, he explained, eyes fixed on the flames. A business decision, trying to build something for our future. Needed special stock from Montana. Eleanor wasn't due for another month. He drew a shaky breath. Crawford, the banker, offered to buy my south pasture. Said the railroad was coming. Wanted the land. Offered enough to hire the doctor from Denver for the birth. Best in the territory. But you refused, Abigail guessed. Silas nodded slowly. Thought I was protecting our future. Thought I had time. His voice roughened. Eleanor went into labor early. Complications. By the time I got back 3 days later, I'd lost them both. You couldn't have known, Abigail interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. Neither of us could have. They looked at each other, firelight catching gold in Abigail's dark hair, shadowing the grief lines around Silas's eyes. We're both carrying guilt that ain't ours to carry, Abigail whispered. Silas nodded slowly. Reckon we are. The fourth afternoon, the wind finally died. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows. Silas taught Abigail to dance. No music, just his humming an old tune his mother once sang. They moved clumsily in the small space, laughing when they bumped into furniture. The laughter faded. They stood close, swaying gently, his hand on her waist, hers on his shoulder. The moment stretched, fragile and precious. Silas leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was tentative, gentle, full of question and answer both. Abigail pulled back first, breathing unsteadily. Silas, I can't. If I ruin you, you ain't ruining nothing, he said firmly. You're fixing what's been broke. She kissed him again, less tentative this time. The fire crackled. The storm outside had passed. The storm inside was just beginning, the good kind, the kind that washes things clean. When they separated, Silas smiled, actually smiled, the first genuine one Abigail had seen on his face. Reckon we're in trouble now, he said softly. Reckon we are, she agreed, but her eyes shone with a light that had been absent since Philadelphia. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They opened the door to find Emmett Crawford waiting on horseback, his expensive coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the humble cabin. Crawford's cold eyes took in their disheveled appearance, the single trail of footprints between cabin and barn, the intimacy evident in their stance. Well, well, he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Isn't this interesting? The lonely widower and his nurse. How charitable of you, Thornton. Silas stepped forward, positioning himself between Crawford and Abigail. State your business, Crawford. The banker dismounted leisurely, confidence in every movement. Just checking on my investment. This land's value increases every day with the railroad coming. He glanced at Abigail. Though I see you found other ways to warm your cabin this winter. Silas's hands clenched into fists. You've said your piece. Now leave. Not quite. Crawford's smile disappeared. See, the town has standards, Thornton. Moral standards. A man and woman living together, unmarried. He clicked his tongue. The church board will be most distressed to hear of it. What I do on my property ain't the church's business, Silas growled. Everything in Evergreen Valley is the church's business, and mine as its treasurer. Crawford straightened his coat. 1 week, Thornton. Send her away within 7 days or face consequences. I don't owe you enough for foreclosure, Silas challenged. Crawford's smile returned, colder than before. You will. I own your credit. 1 word from me and you can't buy seed, supplies, nothing. You'll be bankrupt by spring. He leaned closer. But I'll make you a deal. Send the woman away, sign over this land, and I'll forgive your debts. Keep her, and I'll bury you. Why? Silas demanded. Why do you want this land so bad? Railroad's coming through. This valley is the best route. Your land sits right in the path. Crawford straightened in the saddle. I'd rather buy it cheap than pay fair value. It's just business. Thornton, nothing personal. A man who won't stand for something will fall for anything, Silas said quietly. Crawford's face hardened. 1 week. He rode away, leaving Silas and Abigail standing in the cold, the warmth of the previous evening shattered by the cold light of reality. Inside, Abigail had heard everything through the thin walls. She looked at Silas, saw the helpless rage in his eyes, and made her decision. That night, as Silas slept fitfully in the barn, she packed her medical bag and wrote a letter in careful script. You gave me back my life. I won't take yours in return. Thank you for everything. You are the best man I've ever known. At dawn, she walked toward town, bag in hand, letter left on the table. She made it perhaps a mile before Silas caught up on horseback. He dismounted, blocked her path physically. Don't you dare decide for me, he said, voice raw with emotion. I won't let you lose everything for me. Tears froze on Abigail's cheeks. You've lost enough. I lost one woman because I wasn't there, Silas's voice cracked. I ain't losing another by letting her walk away. If standing with you cost me this land, so be it. Land can be bought again, but you? He swallowed hard. There ain't another you. Abigail's face crumpled. Silas, whatever happens, we face it together. That's what... She couldn't quite say the word. When they love each other, Silas finished softly. Abigail nodded, throat tight with emotion. They stood in the frozen road, breath clouding between them, two people who had lost everything once and were refusing to lose each other now. Exhausted, they sat in the snow, Silas taking her hand in his. I choose you, he said simply. Whatever comes. Abigail leaned against his shoulder. Then we face it together. They returned to the cabin as the sun rose higher. 7 days until Crawford's deadline. 7 days to find a miracle or lose everything. That night, a wolf howled in the distance, circling, waiting, patient as death. But inside the cabin, two people sat together by firelight, hands clasped, refusing to let fear win. As dawn broke the following morning, Silas found Abigail already awake, wrapping herbs in small cloth bundles. She'd been building her stores gradually, wild plants gathered during brief moments of clear weather, donations from grateful patients, a few precious medicines from her original bag. Each bundle she labeled carefully in neat handwriting. Early start, he observed, stoking the fire. Couldn't sleep, she admitted, thinking about Crawford. Silas nodded, understanding. The banker's threat hung over them like a storm cloud. 6 days remained until his deadline. Got some ideas, Silas said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. Could try speaking to Reverend Parker directly before Crawford poisons the well. Abigail accepted the mug gratefully. Do you think he'd listen? He's fair-minded, not like some. Silas hesitated. And there's Josiah Miller, the town doctor. Crawford respects him, at least publicly. You want me to appeal to a doctor? Skepticism colored Abigail's voice. My experience with doctors hasn't exactly been favorable lately. Before Silas could respond, urgent pounding rattled the door. He opened it to find Ezekiel Blackwood standing there, panic etched on his weathered face. Though in his late 60s, the man was still powerfully built, his usual dignified composure now shattered. "It's Nathan," he gasped, breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. "My grandson. His leg, gangrene, the doctor says. Wants to take it off. The boy's only 12, for God's sake." Abigail was already gathering supplies. "How long has it been infected?" 4 days. Cut himself on rusty farm equipment. Thought it would heal on its own. Ezekiel's voice cracked. Mary's beside herself. He's her only child. "I need to see him immediately," Abigail said, tying her medical apron. "Silas, I'll need hot water, clean linens, my herb pouch from the shelf." Silas nodded, already moving to prepare. Within minutes, they were in Ezekiel's wagon, racing through the snow toward the Blackwood farm. As they traveled, Abigail questioned Ezekiel about Nathan's symptoms: fever, swelling, the appearance of the wound. The old man answered as best he could, his hands white-knuckled on the reins. "It's Miller's coming back this afternoon with what we just saw," Ezekiel said grimly. "Says it's the only way." Abigail's jaw tightened. "Let me examine Nathan first. Amputation should be the last resort, not the first." Nathan Blackwood lay pale and sweating in his bed, his right leg swollen grotesquely below the knee. The wound was a jagged 4-inch gash across his shin, now oozing yellow-green pus with a sickening smell. Angry red streaks extended upward toward his knee, the telltale sign of advancing infection. The boy's face was flushed with fever, his breath coming in shallow pants. Mary Blackwood, a slender woman with the same determined eyes as her father, dabbed her son's forehead with a damp cloth. Her own face was haggard from sleepless nights. "Miller said amputation is the only option," she whispered as Abigail examined the leg. "He's coming back this afternoon to do it." Abigail carefully probed the area around the wound, noting Nathan's wince even through his fever. She examined the red streaks, felt the heat radiating from the infection. "The infection is severe but contained," she finally declared. "We might save the leg, but we need to act fast." She looked at Silas. "I need your help. This will be painful for him." Mary bit her lip. "Do what you must. Just save my boy." For the next 2 hours, Abigail worked with methodical precision. First, she had Silas heat several knives in the fire until they glowed red, then cool them in alcohol she'd brought. She mixed a poultice of crushed herbs, honey, and bread mold she'd been cultivating specifically for infections. When it came time to drain the wound, Silas held the boy down while Mary placed a leather strap between his teeth. Nathan's screams, muffled by the strap, tore through the room as Abigail cut into the infected area. "Almost done, son," Silas murmured, his voice steady as he held the thrashing boy. "You're being braver than most grown men I know." Tears streamed down Nathan's face, but he nodded, biting harder on the strap. Mary turned away, unable to watch, while Ezekiel stood like a statue in the doorway, his face ashen. Abigail worked tirelessly, draining the wound of putrid matter, cutting away dead tissue, and flushing the area with a heated solution of salt water and herbs. Finally, she applied her poultice and wrapped the leg in clean bandages. "He'll need the poultice changed every 4 hours," she instructed Mary, washing blood from her hands in a basin. "Keep him hydrated, willow bark tea for the fever. I've mixed enough poultice for 3 days. I'll return tomorrow to check his progress." Nathan had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his breathing steadier now. The fever still burned, but his face looked less tortured. Outside the bedroom, Ezekiel waited anxiously. Will he keep the leg? If infection doesn't spread by morning, yes. The next 24 hours are critical. Abigail dried her hands on a clean towel. "But Dr. Miller may disagree with my treatment." "Miller can go to hell," Ezekiel growled. "He spent 5 minutes with the ball before declaring the leg lost. You spent hours fighting for it." Mary emerged from the bedroom, her eyes red but determined. "Nathan's sleeping now. He asked for water before he drifted off. First time he's been lucid enough to ask for anything in 2 days." "That's a good sign," Abigail said, squeezing the woman's hand. "You're doing wonderfully, Mary. Keep his spirits up. That's as important as the medicine." As they prepared to leave, Ezekiel pressed a small pouch of coins into Silas's hand. "For the nurse," he said gruffly. Silas tried to refuse, but the older man shook his head firmly. A boy's leg is worth more than money. We pay our debts in this family. On the wagon ride home, Silas noticed Abigail trembling despite the heavy blanket around her shoulders. The adrenaline of the medical emergency was wearing off, leaving her drained. "You did good back there," he said quietly. "I just hope it's enough." Her voice quavered. "If I'm wrong, if the leg can't be saved, I've only prolonged his suffering. And if Miller overrules me, the Blackwoods won't let that happen. Ezekiel's the most respected man in the valley. Even Crawford treads carefully around him." Silas urged the horses through a drift. Old Ezekiel lost his son, Mary's husband, in a mining accident 5 years back. Nathan's all Mary has left. Abigail leaned against Silas's shoulder, exhaustion finally overtaking her. "It's not just about the boy, is it? This is our test. If I fail, the town will never accept me." Silas put his arm around her. "You won't fail. And even if things go wrong, we face it together. Remember?" She nodded against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steady presence as the wagon rolled through the snowy landscape. The following morning, the morning after Miller's visit, they returned to find Nathan's fever broken and the angry red streaks receding. The boy managed a weak smile when Abigail changed the poultice. "Will I still be able to run, ma'am?" he asked as she examined the wound. "If you follow my instructions and rest properly, I believe you will." She squeezed his hand. "You're healing well, Nathan. You're a fighter." Mary tearfully embraced Abigail. He woke up asking for breakfast. "Dr. Miller came last night with his saw and assistants. Father sent him away. He was furious." "I imagine he was," Abigail said diplomatically. "Let him be furious," Ezekiel declared, entering the room. "My grandson keeps his leg. That's what matters." They were preparing to leave when the sound of approaching horses drew them outside. Dr. Josiah Miller dismounted stiffly, his expression thunderous beneath his silver hair. Behind him rode Emmett Crawford and 2 members of the church board, solemn men in black coats. "Blackwood," Miller called, his voice carrying across the yard. "I need to speak with you about this interference in my patient's treatment." Ezekiel stood firm on his porch, shoulders squared. "Your patient is my grandson, doctor, and he's recovering nicely without your saw." Miller's gaze fell on Abigail, recognition flickering across his features. For a moment, something like shock registered in his eyes, quickly masked by professional indignation. "So, this is the nurse I've been hearing about," he said, approaching slowly. He was an imposing figure, tall and lean, with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes that had seen decades of suffering. The one practicing medicine without credentials or permission. "She has my permission," Ezekiel stated flatly. "On my property." "The boy could have died from this experimentation," Miller countered, removing his gloves. "He would have lost his leg under your care," Abigail responded quietly but firmly. "The infection was severe but localized. Amputation was premature." Crawford stepped forward, a satisfied smile on his lips. "This is exactly the sort of dangerous situation I warned about, Thornton. An unqualified woman making medical decisions, risking lives." "Unqualified?" Ezekiel scoffed. "She saved my grandson's leg when your precious doctor was ready to hack it off without trying anything else first." "Watch yourself, Blackwood," Crawford warned. "Even you have loans with my bank. And I can pay them off tomorrow if I choose," Ezekiel retorted. "Don't threaten me in my own yard, Crawford." The 2 church board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. Miller, however, seemed strangely detached from the confrontation, studying Abigail with narrowed eyes. "Where did you train, miss?" he asked suddenly. "Foster, Abigail Foster. I trained at Philadelphia Women's Medical College and served 5 years at Mercy Hospital." Something flickered in Miller's eyes again. "Foster, too," he repeated softly, almost to himself. Then louder. "Mercy Hospital, you say? Under whose direction?" "Dr. Edward Harrington," Abigail answered, puzzled by his intensity. Miller seemed to reach some private decision. "I see." He turned to Crawford. "I'd like to examine the boy myself before further accusations are made." "That hardly seems," Crawford began, clearly expecting Miller's automatic support. "I insist," Miller cut him off sharply, "as the medical authority here." Inside, Miller examined Nathan thoroughly, his experienced hands gentle but thorough. Abigail stood nearby, explaining her treatment in professional terms. The drainage technique, the composition of her poultice, the schedule of changing bandages. To her surprise, Miller listened attentively, asking detailed questions that revealed genuine medical interest rather than skepticism. "The bread mold in your poultice," he said quietly. "That's an unusual addition. My father found it effective for infections. The specific type that grows on rye bread seems particularly potent." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting approach." When he'd finished, Miller straightened and looked at Mary. "Keep following Miss Foster's instructions. The wound is draining properly." He turned to Abigail and nodded once. "The treatment appears to be working. The boy is improving." His eyes held newfound respect. Unconventional approach, but effective in this case. Crawford, waiting impatiently by the door, frowned. "So you approve of this unauthorized practice, doctor?" "I approve of results, Mr. Crawford." Miller gathered his bag. "And I recognize competent care when I see it." He nodded to Abigail. "I'd like to speak with you further about your methods, Miss Foster. Perhaps you could visit my office tomorrow." After they departed, Silas looked at Abigail questioningly. "That wasn't what I expected." "Nor I," she admitted, watching the riders disappear down the road. "He seemed familiar somehow, like he recognized me, though we've never met." Ezekiel clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Whatever just happened, I'd call it a victory. Miller rarely admits when he's wrong." As they prepared to leave, Mary pressed a basket of fresh bread and preserves into Abigail's hands. "It's not enough for saving Nathan's leg, but it's what we can offer today." "It's more than enough," Abigail assured her, touched by the family's gratitude. On the ride home, Silas noticed Abigail lost in thought. "Something troubling you?" "Miller," she said slowly. "The way he reacted when I mentioned my name, and again with Mercy Hospital." She shook her head. "It was almost as if—" "As if what?" "As if he knew me or knew of me." She sighed. "I'm probably imagining things. Just tired." Silas covered her hand with his. "Get some rest when we return. You've earned it." But as they approached the cabin, it became clear that rest would have to wait. A black buggy stood parked outside, its horse stamping impatiently in the snow. Dr. Miller waited on their porch, his expression unreadable. That night, after Deacon Miller's surprising revelations about her father, Abigail fell into an exhausted sleep. But peace didn't come. Instead, her mind dragged her back to Philadelphia, to the day her life had shattered. In her dream, she stood again in the hospital director's office, a grand room with mahogany furniture and medical diplomas lining the walls. The hospital board sat in a semicircle before her, 12 men in expensive suits, their facing masks of righteous indignation. And at their center, Judge Sullivan, his gray beard quivering with rage. "Miss Foster," the director was saying, "the evidence is irrefutable. You deliberately abandoned Judge Sullivan in his critical hour to attend to a servant girl, resulting in the judge's death." "The judge was beyond saving," Dream Abigail protested. "Rebecca had pneumonia, treatable if caught early." "You are not qualified to make such determinations," Sullivan thundered, pounding his fist on the table. "My father was a pillar of this community. You chose to save a nobody over a somebody." The dream shifted. Now she stood in the hospital corridor, nurses and doctors she'd worked alongside for years watching as the director ceremoniously tore her nursing certificate in half. Mercy Hospital no longer recognizes Abigail Foster as a nurse. Her actions demonstrate a callous disregard for proper medical priority and a dangerous independent streak unsuitable for our profession. Whispers surrounded her. Murderer. Killed the judge. Thought herself above the doctors. Then she was outside in the snow, her belongings in a small suitcase, no gloves for her hands, no destination in mind. A small girl with dark hair, Rebecca, appeared before her. "Why couldn't you save us both?" the child asked, her eyes accusing. But this Rebecca wasn't the servant girl. This was her own sister, dead 20 years from fever because their family couldn't afford a doctor. "I tried," Abigail sobbed. "I tried, Rebecca." She woke with a cry, sitting upright in bed, her nightgown soaked with sweat despite the cold room. The fire had died down to embers, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. Silas was beside her instantly, moving from his pallet near the hearth. "Abigail, what is it?" She couldn't answer, trembling too violently as the nightmare's emotions still gripped her. Silas sat on the bed's edge, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, his presence solid and reassuring. "Just a dream," he murmured. "You're safe." When she could finally speak, the words tumbled out in a broken whisper. "Rebecca, she wasn't just the servant girl I saved. She was my sister's name too." She looked up at Silas, moonlight catching the tears on her cheeks. "My sister died when I was 9. Fever. We couldn't afford the doctor." Silas's arm tightened around her. "You never said. It's why I became a nurse, why I'll always choose to help those who can't afford proper care." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "When that servant girl came in with the same symptoms, the same age, I couldn't let another Rebecca die." They sat together in the darkness, the confession hanging in the air between them. Another piece of her past revealed, another layer of understanding between them. "Try to sleep," Silas said finally, moving to return to his pallet. Abigail caught his hand. "Stay? Just until I fall asleep?" He nodded, settling beside her on top of the blankets, his back against the headboard, her head against his chest. His heartbeat, steady and strong, gradually lulled her back to sleep, this time without dreams. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," Miller said as they invited him inside, "but our conversation couldn't wait." Abigail busied herself making tea while Silas built up the fire. Miller's eyes took in the modest cabin, lingering on the examination corner Silas had constructed for Abigail, with its clean surfaces and organized supplies. "You've established quite an operation here," he observed. "People need care," Abigail replied simply. "Many can't afford the journey to town or your fees." Miller accepted the tea with a nod of thanks. "That's partly why I've come. There's something you should know, Miss Foster." He set down his cup carefully. "I knew your father, William Foster." Abigail nearly dropped her cup. You knew my father?" "We trained together at Pennsylvania Hospital. Must be 40 years ago now." Miller's expression softened with memory. "Brilliant physician. One of the finest diagnosticians I ever knew." "How is this possible?" Abigail whispered. "The medical community is smaller than you might think." Miller sighed heavily. "I was at Mercy Hospital too 30 years ago, before I came west. Your father and I worked together for several years." Silas watched Abigail carefully, seeing the shock and confusion on her face. "If you knew him," she said slowly, "then you know what happened to him, how his career ended." Miller nodded gravely. "I do, and that's the other reason I'm here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "History is repeating itself, Miss Foster, and I won't stand silently by this time." "What do you mean?" Silas asked. 30 years ago, Judge Sullivan's father, the original Judge Sullivan, was brought to Mercy Hospital with pneumonia. William Foster was the attending physician. At the same time, a young mother from the tenements arrived with her infant, also gravely ill. Understanding dawned on Abigail's face. "My father chose to treat the baby first." "He did. The elder Sullivan died while your father was saving that child." Miller's hands tightened around his cup. "Sullivan's family destroyed William's reputation, just as they've now done to you." "Why didn't you defend him?" Abigail demanded, anger flaring suddenly. "Because I was a coward," Miller admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I had a promising career, a young family. Speaking against the Sullivans meant professional suicide." Shame colored his features. "I've carried that regret for 30 years. When I saw you today, heard your name, I knew I couldn't make the same mistake twice." Silas placed a supportive hand on Abigail's shoulder. "What does this mean for our situation now?" "It means you have an ally," Miller said firmly. "Crawford sought my support to discredit Miss Foster. Instead, I will publicly endorse her skills." He looked directly at Abigail. "I cannot undo what happened to your father, but I can ensure his daughter doesn't suffer the same fate." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. He died believing himself a failure, penniless, his reputation in tatters. "He was never a failure," Miller said gently. "Every life he saved was a testament to his skill and compassion, including that infant from the tenements." He hesitated, "who, I believe, grew up to become quite remarkable herself." "What do you mean, Adine?" Abigail asked. "The baby your father saved that day was Olivia Blackwood's daughter, Mary, Nathan's mother." Silas stared in disbelief. Mary? The woman whose son Abigail just saved? Life has a way of coming full circle, Miller said quietly. Your father saved Mary. Now you've saved her son. Abigail sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. For years, she'd carried her father's story as a cautionary tale, how principle could cost everything. Now, suddenly, it had become something else, a legacy of compassion spanning generations. There's more you should know, Miller continued. Crawford doesn't just want Silas's land for the railroad. He has a personal reason. The doctor looked to Silas. Did you ever wonder why he's so fixated on your particular parcel? Silas shook his head, assumed it was just business, the location. 20 years ago, before you settled here, there was a mining accident on that land. A shaft collapsed, killing 3 men. Miller's voice grew heavy. One of them was Crawford's only son, James. My God, Silas whispered. I never knew. Crawford wants the land to build a memorial chapel where his son died. The railroad is just his excuse for acquiring it cheaply. Why not simply tell me the truth, Silas asked, bewildered. I would have understood that. Pride, Miller said simply, and bitterness. Crawford believes that grief should be private, controlled. Your loss, the way you honor Eleanor and Grace with that simple cross on the hill, it offends him somehow, reminds him of his own pain that he's never properly faced. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miller prepared to leave. At the door, he turned to them once more. Crawford has gathered the church board to discuss your situation. They meet tomorrow. I'll speak on your behalf, but be prepared. This isn't over yet. After Miller departed, Abigail and Silas sat in silence, absorbing all they had learned. The weight of the past, their own and others, pressed heavily upon them. My father, Abigail said finally, her voice small. All this time, I thought his sacrifice meant nothing. That principle only led to ruin. But it didn't, Silas said gently. Look at the chain he started. Mary lived because of him. Nathan keeps his leg because of you. That's not nothing. Abigail leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. And what about us? What chain are we starting by standing against Crawford? Silas held her close. Don't know yet, but whatever comes, we face it. Together, she finished, her voice steadier now. Outside, the winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Inside, newfound understanding illuminated the path forward, no less difficult, but clearer now. That evening, as Abigail sorted her medical supplies, Silas disappeared into the bedroom. He returned holding Eleanor's letter, the paper worn from countless readings. Think it's time you knew what this says, he said quietly, handing it to her. Especially now. Abigail hesitated. Silas, these are her private words to you. You don't have to share them. Want to. His voice was gentle but firm. Need to. With careful hands, Abigail unfolded the letter, Eleanor's delicate handwriting flowing across the page. My dearest Silas, if you're reading this, then what I fear has come to pass. I pray our child lives, even if I do not. But if we are both gone, I need you to know something important. Crawford came to me last week with an offer, not for the land, but for you. He said if I convinced you to sell, he would ensure the best doctor attended the birth. I refuse to manipulate you that way. Some prices are too high, even for safety. So if we are lost, please don't blame yourself for being away. The choice was mine too. We build our lives on principles worth upholding, even when it costs us dearly. One more thing, my love. If I'm gone, don't bury your heart with me. That would be the true tragedy. Promise me you'll find happiness again someday. Love isn't finite. Loving again doesn't diminish what we shared. Forever yours, Eleanor. Tears streamed down Abigail's face as she finished reading. She looked up at Silas, seeing the same emotion reflected in his eyes. She knew, Abigail whispered, about Crawford's manipulation, about everything. Silas nodded, his voice rough with feeling. Been carrying that letter for 3 years, reading it over and over, but never really hearing what she was saying. He took a deep breath. She didn't want me to stop living, and I did anyway until you came. Abigail gently folded the letter and returned it to him. She was an extraordinary woman. Yes, Silas agreed, and she would have liked you. Your stubbornness, your principles. They sat together by the fire, the letter between them, not a barrier to their growing feelings, but a blessing from the past. When Silas finally spoke again, his voice was steadier. We should prepare for tomorrow. Crawford won't give up easily. No, Abigail agreed, but neither will we. That night, Silas didn't sleep in the barn. Instead, they shared the narrow bed, finding comfort in each other's presence as the winter wind howled outside. No words of love were spoken aloud, but none were needed. Their intertwined hands said everything necessary. The evening before the church meeting, Olivia Blackwood arrived with a basket of food and news from town. Word spreading about the miracle nurse who saved Nathan's leg, she reported, helping Abigail prepare a simple stew. Crawford's furious. Miller's surprising support has undermined his position. How do you think tomorrow will go? Abigail asked, cutting potatoes. The town's divided, Olivia admitted. Those Crawford holds financial power over will support him. But those you've helped, and there are many now, they'll stand with you. Silas, repairing a chair by the fire, looked up. What about Reverend Parker? He's a good man, but cautious. Crawford's the largest donor to the church. Olivia stirred the stew thoughtfully. Parker won't oppose Crawford directly, but he might seek compromise. Later, after Olivia had left, Abigail and Silas sat at the table, making preparations for the next day. They organized evidence of Abigail's work, a ledger of patients treated, letters of gratitude, examples of her medical knowledge. Do you ever wonder, Abigail asked suddenly, if it's worth all this trouble? You had a peaceful life before I arrived. Silas reached across the table, taking her hand. Peaceful isn't the same as living. I was just existing until you came along. His thumb traced circles on her palm. Besides, Eleanor's letter said it clear. Some principles are worth standing for, even when it costs dear. Abigail squeezed his hand. Olivia told me something before she left. She said sometimes you have to stand straight even when the whole world wants you to bow. Smart woman, that Olivia, Silas replied with a small smile. They prepared for bed with the quiet efficiency of people who had developed rhythms together. As snow began falling again outside, they lay side by side in the darkness, hands clasped between them. Whatever happens tomorrow, Abigail whispered, thank you for choosing me over the land. Silas turned to face her, his features barely visible in the dying firelight. Best choice I ever made. The church board meeting was scheduled for noon. Silas and Abigail arrived early, finding the small white church already crowded. Word had spread throughout the valley. This wasn't just about a widower and a nurse living under one roof. This was about power, about who defined morality in Evergreen Valley. Olivia and Ezekiel Blackwood sat prominently in the front pew. Beside them, Mary cradled young Nathan, his leg properly bandaged but healing well. Other families Abigail had treated filled the remaining seats: farmers, ranchers, working people who rarely attended regular services, but had come today in silent support. Crawford stood near the altar with Reverend Parker and the 4 other board members, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright hostility. Dr. Miller sat slightly apart, his face carefully neutral, but his posture resolute. As Silas and Abigail moved to sit, a murmur rippled through the assembly. Crawford stepped forward, satisfaction evident in his smile. Ah, Mr. Thornton, Miss Foster, so kind of you to join us. His voice carried to every corner of the church. We've gathered to discuss your living arrangement, which has caused considerable concern among our God-fearing community. Reverend Parker, a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, looked uncomfortable. Now, Emmett, let's approach this with charity. Charity? Crawford interrupted. Is that what we're calling it now? This woman, an outsider with a questionable past, moved into an unmarried man's home, practices medicine without license, and undermines our town doctor's authority. What would you call it, Reverend? Before Parker could respond, Dr. Miller rose. I would call it compassionate care, Mr. Crawford. Miss Foster's training is exemplary, her skills impressive. I've examined several of her patients, including young Nathan Blackwood. Her work is beyond reproach. Crawford's eyes narrowed. Your professional opinion is noted, doctor, but we're discussing moral standards here, not medical ones. Then perhaps I should speak, Mary Blackwood said, standing with Nathan at her side. Her voice, though soft, carried surprising strength. This woman saved my son's leg when others would have taken it. If that's not God's work, I don't know what is. Other voices joined in. A farmer whose infected hand Abigail had saved, an elderly woman with chronic pain whom she treated when no one else would, a young mother whose difficult delivery Abigail had safely managed. With each testimony, Crawford's face darkened. Finally, he raised his hands for silence. Touching anecdotes aside, the fact remains. An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man violates the moral fabric of our community. It sets a dangerous precedent. Then I have a solution, Silas said, his voice steady as he rose to his feet. All eyes turned to him. Miss Foster and I will marry. Problem solved. A shocked silence fell over the church. Abigail stared at Silas, her eyes wide. Though they'd grown close, neither had spoken explicitly of marriage. Crawford recovered first, laughing coldly. How convenient, but hardly addressing the underlying issue of propriety. The damage to our community standards has already been done. What damage? Ezekiel demanded, standing as well. They've helped dozens of families that your precious standards ignored. When my grandson was dying, where was your moral fabric then, Crawford? The banker's facade cracked slightly. This isn't about the poor. It's about the land, Silas interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. Always has been. You want my property for the railroad, and you'll use any excuse to pressure me into selling. Crawford's face flushed. That's preposterous. Is it? Miller stood again. Perhaps we should tell everyone the real reason you want Thornton's land, Emmett. About the mining accident. About James. A hush fell over the assembly as Crawford paled visibly. That's not relevant, he whispered hoarsely. I think it is, Silas said, his voice gentler now. You could have just told me the truth, Crawford, about your son, about wanting to build a memorial. I would have understood that. Crawford seemed to deflate before their eyes, his carefully constructed authority crumbling. You have no right to speak of him, he said, but the words lacked conviction. I lost my family too, Silas continued. I know what that emptiness feels like, how it hollows you out. He glanced at Abigail, drawing strength from her presence. But using that pain to hurt others won't bring them back. It only ensures the pain continues. The church had fallen completely silent, every person present witnessing Crawford's vulnerability exposed. For a moment, he looked lost, a grieving father rather than a powerful banker. Then a new voice spoke from the back of the church. He's right, Father. All heads turned to see a young woman standing in the doorway, perhaps 25, elegantly dressed, with features that resembled Crawford's. Rebecca, Crawford breathed, shock evident in his voice. What are you doing here? I came to stop this. Rebecca Crawford moved down the aisle with quiet dignity. When you wrote about your plans to force Mr. Thornton from his land, I knew I had to intervene. She turned to face the congregation. My brother James died in a mining accident 20 years ago. My father has never recovered from that loss. Her voice softened with compassion. Instead, he's channeled his grief into control of the town, of its people, of this very church. Rebecca, that's enough, Crawford hissed, but she continued. The memorial chapel he wants to build, it's not just for James. It's a monument to Father's own guilt for sending James to inspect the mine that day. She looked directly at Silas. He sees your simple grave markers, the love they represent, and it makes his elaborate plans seem hollow by comparison. The revelation hung in the air, casting new light on Crawford's actions. The banker stood speechless, exposed not as a villain, but as a broken man unable to face his own pain. Reverend Parker broke the silence. Perhaps we've approached this all wrong, he said gently. Instead of judgment, what's needed here is healing for everyone involved. Silas stepped forward, extending his hand to Crawford. Your son deserves to be remembered. We can find a way to honor him that doesn't require taking my land or hurting Abigail. Crawford stared at the offered hand, decades of bitterness warring with the possibility of release. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. The board will take no action against Mr. Thornton or Miss Foster, Reverend Parker announced. Instead, I propose we focus our energies on more charitable endeavors, perhaps supporting Miss Foster's medical work among those who cannot afford Dr. Miller's services. As the meeting dispersed, Rebecca approached Abigail and Silas. I apologize for my father's actions. she said softly. Grief can warp even the best of men if they refuse to face it. I understand that better than most, Silas replied. Rebecca smiled sadly. I think you do. She glanced toward her father, who stood alone near the altar, looking suddenly old and tired. He needs help, not victory, perhaps in time. As they prepared to leave, Miller caught Abigail's arm. A moment, please. When they were alone, he pressed a small, leather-bound book into her hands. This was your father's medical journal. I've kept it all these years. It belongs with you now. Abigail traced her fingers over the worn cover, her father's initials embossed in faded gold. Thank you, she whispered. The simple words inadequate for the gift he'd given her, a piece of her father's legacy, proof that he hadn't been forgotten. Outside, snow began falling again, gentle this time, not threatening. Silas helped Abigail into their wagon, acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. About what I said in there, he began awkwardly. About marrying. It wasn't just to solve Crawford's complaint. I meant it. He met her eyes directly. If you'll have me. Abigail's smile bloomed slowly like the first flower after winter. Was that a proposal, Silas Thornton? Reckon it was. He took her gloved hand in his. Not very romantic, I know. On the contrary, she said softly, standing up for us in front of the entire town? I can't imagine anything more romantic. As they drove home through the gently falling snow, a weight had lifted from both their shoulders. Crawford's threat had been neutralized, at least temporarily. The town had witnessed their commitment to each other, and somewhere perhaps, Eleanor was smiling. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in comfortable silence, a knock at the door startled them both. Silas opened it to find Rebecca Crawford standing there, her face pale with urgency. You need to come quickly, she said breathlessly. It's my father. He's collapsed. As Abigail grabbed her medical bag and they hurried to follow Rebecca, a folded telegram slipped from Abigail's pocket onto the cabin floor, unnoticed in their haste. It bore a Philadelphia postmark and the name Sullivan clearly visible on the outside. A new threat was already on its way. The night air bit sharply as Silas guided the wagon through fresh snow, following Rebecca Crawford's directions to her father's house. Abigail sat beside him, medical bag clutched tightly in her lap, her mind racing through possible conditions and treatments. Rebecca rode ahead on horseback, her cloak billowing behind her like a dark shadow against the moonlit snow. Crawford's condition had deteriorated rapidly after the church meeting. His face had turned gray mid-sentence before he collapsed. Rebecca and the housekeeper had barely managed to get him to bed. The Crawford estate appeared before them, a stately two-story home at the edge of town, the largest private residence in Evergreen Valley. Lanterns blazed in nearly every window, casting golden rectangles onto the pristine snow. As they approached, Silas noted the ornate ironwork gate, the stone fountain, now frozen for winter, the carefully positioned evergreens flanking the circular drive, all evidence of wealth meticulously displayed. Rebecca led them through the front entrance into a grand foyer with polished hardwood floors and a sweeping staircase. The house smelled of beeswax candles and wood polish, with an underlying hint of tobacco. Despite the emergency, Abigail couldn't help noticing the stark contrast to Silas's humble cabin. He's upstairs, Rebecca said, already climbing the steps. I've sent for Dr. Miller as well, but you were closer. They followed her to a spacious bedroom where Emmett Crawford lay motionless in an enormous four-poster bed. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. Mrs. Winters, the elderly housekeeper, stood beside the bed, her hands twisted in her apron. Abigail moved forward immediately, setting her bag on the bedside table. When did this happen? Perhaps an hour ago, Rebecca answered, hovering anxiously nearby. Right after we returned from the church meeting. He was ranting about the whole affair, then suddenly, Abigail nodded, already checking Crawford's pulse. It was rapid but weak and irregular. She placed her ear against his chest, listening carefully to his heart and lungs. The heartbeat had a troubling murmur, and his breathing sounded congested. When she lifted his eyelids, his pupils were uneven. Has he regained consciousness at all? She asked, pulling a small bottle from her bag. Briefly, Mrs. Winters replied. He mumbled something about James, then drifted off again. Abigail uncorked the bottle, a pungent mixture of spirits of ammonia, and waved it beneath Crawford's modineum. The banker's face twitched, and he groaned but didn't wake. I believe he suffered an apoplectic fit, what some call a stroke, Abigail explained, mixing a powder into water from the bedside pitcher. We need to elevate his head, keep him cool, and try to reduce the congestion in his brain. Silas moved forward to help position Crawford higher against the pillows, while Abigail prepared a cold compress for his forehead. Rebecca watched with wide, frightened eyes. Will he die? She asked in a small voice. Abigail met her gaze steadily. I can't promise anything. The next few hours will tell us much. These fits can be mild or severe. Your father is strong, which works in his favor. Rebecca nodded, visibly struggling to compose herself. Despite the man's actions toward them, Silas felt a pang of sympathy for the daughter who clearly loved her difficult father. A commotion downstairs announced Miller's arrival. The physician entered moments later, slightly breathless from the climb. Miss Foster, I'm glad you're here, he said, setting down his medical bag. What's your assessment? Without hesitation, Abigail described Crawford's symptoms and the treatment she'd begun. Miller listened intently, checking the patient himself before nodding in agreement. Apoplexy indeed, your measures are appropriate. He removed additional instruments from his bag. I would suggest a small bleeding to reduce the pressure on the brain as well. For the next hour, Abigail and Miller worked side by side treating Crawford. The banker remained unconscious, but seemed to breathe easier after their ministrations. When they'd done all they could, Miller stepped back with a sigh. Now we wait, he said. The crisis isn't past. Someone should remain with him through the night, monitoring for changes. I'll stay, Abigail volunteered, surprising everyone, including herself. After all Crawford had done to harm them, her instinctive response was still to help. Miller nodded. I'll return at dawn. Mrs. Winters can show you what you need. As the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled Silas aside. Crawford's condition is serious. If he survives, he may be diminished. Paralysis, speech difficulties, other impairments are common after such episodes. What does that mean for the bank, for the town? Silas asked, thinking of how many lives Crawford controlled through his financial power. That depends on his recovery and what arrangements he's made for succession, Miller replied. His attorney would know. But it could mean significant changes for Evergreen Valley. After Miller departed, Rebecca insisted Silas stay as well, offering him a guest room. It's too late and cold to return to your cabin. Besides, I'd rather not be alone tonight. Silas hesitated, glancing at Abigail, who nodded imperceptibly. Thank you, he said to Rebecca. That's very kind, especially considering my father tried to drive you from your home, Rebecca finished with a sad smile. Perhaps it's time to break that cycle of bitterness. As Mrs. Winters showed Silas to a guest room down the hall, Abigail settled into an armchair beside Crawford's bed to begin her vigil. She arranged her medical supplies within easy reach and accepted the tea Rebecca brought her. The banker's breathing had steadied somewhat, though his color remained poor. Looking at Crawford's unconscious form, Abigail felt an unexpected complexity of emotions. This man had threatened everything she and Silas were building. Yet here she was, fighting to save his life, not out of obligation or to prove something, but because it was simply what she did, what her father would have done. Rebecca sat across from her, on the other side of the bed. You don't have to do this, you know, she said softly. No one would blame you for letting Dr. Miller handle it alone, I would blame me, Abigail replied simply. Rebecca studied her for a long moment. You really believe in this, don't you? Helping people regardless of who they are or what they've done. It's not about belief, it's about who I am. Abigail adjusted the compress on Crawford's forehead. Your father and I disagreed deeply, but he's still a human being deserving of care. He wasn't always like this, Rebecca said, her gaze drifting to her father's ashen face. Before James died, he was different. Stricter than most fathers, perhaps, but he could laugh then. He taught us to ride horses, to fish in the stream beyond the property. After the accident, she trailed off, lost in memory. Grief changes people, Abigail offered. Some it softens, others it hardens. Like your father, Rebecca said. Dr. Miller mentioned something about him at the church. Abigail nodded. He was a doctor in Philadelphia. He died in poverty after his reputation was destroyed for choosing to save a child instead of a powerful man. Yet you followed in his footsteps anyway. Because he was right, Abigail said firmly. The value of a life isn't measured by wealth or status. They fell silent, the only sounds the crackling fire and Crawford's labored breathing. Outside, snow continued to fall, accumulating on the windowsill in delicate, crystalline patterns. Miss Foster, Abigail, Rebecca said suddenly, there's something you should know. She hesitated, twisting her hands in her lap. After the church meeting, before Father collapsed, a telegram arrived from Philadelphia, from Judge Sullivan. Abigail's blood went cold. Then, what did it say? I don't know exactly. Father read it privately, but it agitated him terribly. He kept saying, they're coming here and this isn't over. Then he had his attack. Rebecca's eyes were troubled. I think it concerns you. Before Abigail could respond, Crawford stirred, a low moan escaping his lips. Both women leaned forward as his eyelids fluttered, then opened. His gaze was unfocused at first, then gradually sharpened as he registered his surroundings. Father? Rebecca said tentatively. Crawford's eyes moved to her face, recognition dawning. He tried to speak, but produced only a garbled sound. Panic flashed across his features as he attempted to lift his right arm, which remained motionless at his side. Mr. Crawford, Abigail said calmly, moving into his line of sight, you've had an apoplectic fit, a stroke. Your right side may be temporarily paralyzed. Try not to agitate yourself. The banker's eyes widened when he saw her, and he struggled harder to speak. Finally, he managed to form words with his left side of his mouth. Why, you here. To help you, Abigail replied simply. Crawford's expression cycled through confusion, suspicion, and finally a weary resignation. His functioning left hand moved across the blanket, fingers trembling, until they found Rebecca's. James, he whispered. Tell her, James. Rebecca squeezed his hand. Rest now, Father. We'll talk when you're stronger. But Crawford's agitation increased. No, he managed with surprising force. Tell now. Papers, desk, secret, drawer. His eyes locked onto Abigail's with an intensity that transcended his physical weakness. Something urgent burned in that gaze, not hatred now, but something like desperation. Please, he whispered, before exhaustion claimed him and his eyes drifted shut again. Rebecca looked to Abigail, confusion evident. What was that about? I don't know, Abigail admitted, checking Crawford's pulse. It was steadier now, his breathing more regular. But it seems important to him. His study is downstairs, Rebecca said slowly. There's a roll-top desk where he keeps important papers. They exchanged a long look, both thinking the same thing. Go, Abigail said finally. I'll watch him. If there's something in those papers that affects Silas and me, we should know. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before nodding and leaving the room. Abigail turned back to her patient, adjusting his blankets and checking his temperature. Whatever secrets the banker kept, they would soon come to light. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered the telegram she'd received days ago, still unopened in her medical bag. Another mystery waiting to be solved. Dawn broke pale and uncertain over Evergreen Valley. In Crawford's bedroom, Abigail dozed lightly in the armchair, exhausted from her night-long vigil. The banker had remained stable through the night, drifting in and out of consciousness but never fully alert. A soft knock at the door roused her. Silas entered, carrying a tray with coffee and bread. Mrs. Winters insisted you eat something, he said quietly, setting the tray on a small table. How is he? Stable, Abigail replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The right side remains paralyzed, and his speech is affected, but his mind seems clear during his conscious moments. Silas nodded, studying the sleeping banker. It was strange seeing the formidable man so diminished, vulnerable in his nightclothes beneath the heavy quilts. And how are you, he asked, resting a hand on Abigail's shoulder. Tired, but all right. She covered his hand with hers. Rebecca told me something concerning last night. Crawford received a telegram from Judge Sullivan just before his attack. Apparently it upset him greatly. Silas frowned. Sullivan from Philadelphia? The man who ruined your reputation? The same. Abigail sipped her coffee, the warmth fortifying her against the chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Rebecca said her father kept repeating, "They're coming here." "That can't be coincidence," Silas murmured. "No," Abigail agreed. "And there's more." Crawford became agitated last night, insisting Rebecca find something in his desk. Papers about someone named James. His son? "I assume so. Rebecca went to look, but hasn't returned yet." As if summoned by her name, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. In her hands, she clutched a stack of papers and a small leather journal. "I found them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "in a hidden compartment of Father's desk. I think you both should see this." She laid the documents on the bed, careful not to disturb her sleeping father. The topmost paper was a deed to Silas's land. "This is the original deed from 20 years ago," Rebecca explained, "when Father first purchased that parcel. But look at the name." Silas leaned closer, reading the faded text. "Original owner, William Foster." He looked up sharply. "Foster? Any relation to—" "My father," Abigail breathed, taking the document with trembling hands. "But how? He never mentioned owning land in the West." "There's more," Rebecca said, opening the journal. "This is Father's private record. It seems your father sold the land to mine after some financial difficulty, but there was a condition attached to the sale." She turned to a specific entry dated 20 years earlier. "Finalized purchase of the Foster claim today. 10 acres with mineral rights. Foster insisted on a clause allowing his heirs right of first refusal should I ever sell the property. Agreed to this as a formality. The man has no money for repurchase now, and I doubt his family ever will. Sending James tomorrow to assess the site for silver potential." The next entry, dated 1 day later, was written in a shaky, almost illegible hand. "James is gone. Cave in at the Foster site. My son, my only son. God help me, what have I done?" The journal continued, documenting Crawford's grief and gradual obsession with the land that claimed his son's life. Subsequent entries revealed his determination to build a memorial chapel, his increasing bitterness, and finally, most shockingly, his discovery that Abigail Foster had arrived in Evergreen Valley. December 15, 1884. Incredible news. A nurse named Foster has taken up residence with Thornton. Initial inquiries confirm she is the daughter of William Foster, original owner of the mine property. This changes everything. If she learns of her inheritance rights, my plans for James's memorial could be jeopardized. Must find a way to remove her from the valley before she discovers the truth. Silas and Abigail exchanged stunned glances. "He knew who you were all along," Silas said. "That's why he was so determined to drive you away." "But why not just tell me about the land?" Abigail asked, bewildered. "I had no idea." "Pride, perhaps," Rebecca suggested sadly. "Or shame. The agreement with your father was legally binding. Father couldn't build his memorial if you claimed your rights." "And the telegram from Sullivan?" Abigail asked. Rebecca produced it from among the papers. The message was brief but chilling. "Crawford, stop. Have learned a Foster has surfaced in your territory. Stop. Am sending representatives to handle situation. Stop. Sullivan." "They're coming here," Abigail whispered, echoing Crawford's words. "The Sullivans haven't finished with me yet." A weak voice from the bed interrupted them. "Not finished with any of us." Crawford was awake, his eyes clearer than before, fixed on the papers spread across his coverlet. With visible effort, he lifted his functioning left hand, pointing at Abigail. "You're right," he managed. "Land yours. Father's agreement." Each word seemed to cost him dearly, but determination drove him forward. "Must warn you, Sullivan, dangerous." Rebecca moved to her father's side. "Don't exert yourself, Father." Crawford shook his head stubbornly. "Must tell. James died. My fault. Sent him. Unsafe mine. Your father warned me." His gaze locked onto Abigail's. "Been punishing myself. Punishing everyone. Wrong." Tears streamed down Rebecca's face as she held her father's hand. Abigail stepped forward, professional instincts taking over as she checked his pulse and breathing. "You should rest, Mr. Crawford," she said gently. "We can discuss this when you are stronger." "No time," he insisted. "Sullivan arrives tomorrow. Powerful, vindictive. Wants you gone." His fingers tightened around Rebecca's. "Must make amends. Help them. Promise me." "I promise, Father," Rebecca whispered. Crawford seemed satisfied with this. His eyes drifted shut again, exhaustion claiming him. But his breathing was steadier now, as if unburdening himself had provided some relief. A knock at the door heralded Dr. Miller's arrival for his morning check. As he examined Crawford, Abigail, Silas, and Rebecca withdrew to the hallway, the shocking revelations still reverberating between them. "So the land legally belongs to Abigail?" Silas asked, trying to process everything. "According to Father's records, yes," Rebecca confirmed. "And now there's the threat from Sullivan to consider." "We need to see the original agreement between our fathers," Abigail said, "and find out exactly when these representatives are arriving from Philadelphia." Miller emerged from the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind him. "His condition has improved," he reported. "The paralysis may be permanent, I'm afraid, but his mind remains sharp. With proper care, he could live many more years, though not as the man he was." "And the bank?" Rebecca asked. "Father's business affairs?" "That's a legal matter," Miller replied. "But typically, without a clear succession plan, the bank's board would assume temporary control." He studied their troubled faces. "Has something happened?" Briefly, they shared their discoveries. Miller listened intently, stroking his silver beard. "So Sullivan is sending people here," he mused. "This complicates matters considerably." "What can Sullivan possibly do?" Silas asked. "This isn't Philadelphia. His influence can't reach here." "Don't underestimate the Sullivans," Abigail said quietly. "Their wealth brings influence anywhere, and they're ruthless when they believe they've been wronged." "We need a plan," Miller said decisively, "and quickly." As they descended the grand staircase to continue their discussion in Crawford's study, none of them noticed the small figure lurking in the shadows of the upper landing, Mrs. Winters, who had heard every word. The housekeeper slipped away silently, heading for the back stairs. She had served the Crawford family faithfully for 20 years, but her monthly stipend from Judge Sullivan for information had supplemented her income nicely for the past 5. Mrs. Winters moved quickly through the servants' passage to her quarters, where she retrieved a small notebook from beneath a loose floorboard. In it were recorded dates, names, and payments, a detailed account of her correspondence with Sullivan. She scribbled a hasty note about the Foster land claim and the banker's stroke, then donned her heaviest cloak. 20 minutes later, she hurried through the back door of the telegraph office, pressing coins and paper into the operator's hand. "Urgent message to Philadelphia. Judge Edward Sullivan," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Tell him the Foster girl has discovered everything." It was time to send an urgent message to her other employer. By mid-morning, Silas and Abigail had returned to their cabin, laden with documents from Crawford's study. Rebecca had insisted they take everything related to the land claim, along with her father's journal. "You need these more than we do now," she had said. "Father would want to make things right." At the cabin, they spread the papers across the table, piecing together the story. William Foster, Abigail's father, had purchased the land 30 years ago as an investment after treating a patient with mining connections. When his reputation was destroyed and finances crumbled, he'd been forced to sell to Crawford, but had wisely inserted the clause protecting his daughter's future interests. "Your father was trying to secure something for you," Silas said, studying the agreement, even as he lost everything else. Abigail's fingers traced her father's signature. "He never told me. Perhaps he was too ashamed of losing our family's last asset." "According to this," Silas continued, "you have right of first refusal if Crawford sells the land, which technically includes my current parcel," he realized. "The original Foster claim was larger than what I own now. Crawford must have sold off portions over the years, but kept the section with the mine where James died. So legally, Crawford should have offered you the chance to buy my land before selling it to me," Silas confirmed. "The fact that he didn't makes my deed questionable." Abigail sat back, overwhelmed. "All this time I believed I had nothing left from my father. Now I discover I have a claim to land. Your land." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. The land is yours, Silas. You've built your life here." Silas reached across the table, taking her hand. "Our life," he corrected gently. "Whatever this legal tangle means, we'll figure it out together." A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Miller stood outside, his expression grave. "We may have less time than we thought," he said, stamping snow from his boots as he entered. "Mrs. Winters has disappeared from the Crawford house. Rebecca believes she's gone to send a message to Sullivan. She was spying for him? Abigail asked incredulously. Miller nodded. It appears so. The station master confirms she sent an urgent telegram this morning. If she's alerted Sullivan's people about what we've discovered, they'll move faster, Silas concluded grimly. There's more, Miller added. The morning stage brought a visitor to town, a lawyer named Hargrove, asking questions about a nurse named Foster. He's taken a room at the hotel. Abigail paled. They're already here. What do they want? Silas demanded. After all this time, why is Sullivan still pursuing you? It's not just about me anymore, Abigail realized. It's about the land too. If Sullivan learns I have a legal claim to property, he'll try to take it, Miller finished, as a final punishment for what he sees as your family's offense against his. They sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of the situation. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice determined. Then we don't wait for them to come to us. We act first. He turned to Miller. Is Hargrove the only one who's arrived? So far, Miller confirmed. Thin man, expensively dressed, city manners. Doesn't look like he's used to small western towns. Good. Silas stood, decision made. Then here's what we'll do. The Evergreen Hotel was the town's only accommodation for travelers, a modest two-story building with 10 rooms and a small restaurant that served passable meals. Harold Hargrove, a scrawl, sat at a corner table, picking unenthusiastically at a plate of beef stew. His immaculate suit and polished shoes marked him immediately as an outsider, as did his obvious distaste for his surroundings. When Abigail entered the restaurant alone, Hargrove's gaze snapped to her immediately. Recognition flashed in his eyes. He'd clearly been provided with a description. Smoothly, he rose and approached her table. Miss Foster, I presume, he said, his Philadelphia accent pronounced against the western drawls that filled the room. Harold Hargrove, attorney at law. Might I join you? Please do, Abigail replied calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. This was the dangerous part of their plan, engaging directly with Sullivan's representative. I understand you've been asking about me. Hargrove smiled thinly as he sat. Word travels quickly in small towns. He removed papers from his leather portfolio. I represent Judge Edward Sullivan of Philadelphia. I believe you're acquainted with him. We've met, Abigail said neutrally, though I'm surprised his interest extends so far west. The judge is a thorough man, Hargrove replied. When he learned of your situation here, he became concerned. Concerned for my welfare? How touching. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. Concerned about potential misunderstandings. You left Philadelphia under something of a cloud, Miss Foster. The judge wishes to resolve any lingering issues. How generous, Abigail said, matching his false civility. And what resolution does he propose? The lawyer slid a document across the table. A simple agreement. In exchange for a modest financial settlement, you formally retract any claims or statements regarding your dismissal from Mercy Hospital, acknowledge your professional error in the judge's father's case, and agree to relocate to another territory, perhaps California. The judge suggests a fresh start would benefit everyone. Abigail scanned the document, noting the paltry sum offered, barely enough for train fare, and the comprehensive admissions of guilt it required her to make. And if I decline, she asked, already knowing the answer. Hargrove's expression hardened slightly. The judge has extensive connections, Miss Foster. Banking, railroad, territorial governance. Life could become difficult for you here. He glanced around the restaurant. I understand you formed attachments. It would be unfortunate if those connections suffered due to your stubbornness. A threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable, just as they had anticipated. I see, Abigail said thoughtfully. And what about the land? Hargrove blinked, momentarily thrown. Land? The Foster claim. Surely Judge Sullivan is aware of my inheritance rights. It's why you're really here, isn't it? The lawyer recovered quickly, but not before Abigail caught the flash of surprise. I'm not authorized to discuss any matters beyond the agreement before you. Which means Sullivan doesn't know about the land yet, Abigail concluded. Interesting. Hargrove's composure slipped further. Miss Foster, I advise you to consider the judge's offer carefully. He is not a man who tolerates defiance. Yes, I'm well aware. Abigail stood, leaving the document untouched. Please inform Judge Sullivan that I decline his generous offer. I have no intention of leaving Evergreen Valley or admitting to wrongs I didn't commit. You're making a grave mistake, Hargrove warned, rising as well. The judge has sent others besides myself, men with less diplomatic methods. I look forward to meeting them, Abigail replied steadily. Good day, Mr. Hargrove. She left the restaurant with measured steps, feeling the lawyer's glare burning into her back. Outside, Silas waited with the wagon, anxiety evident in his tense posture. Well, he asked as she climbed up beside him. It worked, Abigail confirmed. Sullivan doesn't know about the land claim yet. He sent Hargrove ahead to intimidate me into leaving, but mentioned others coming with less diplomatic methods. Silas urged the horses forward. Then we proceed with the next step. Miller's waiting at his office with the documents. As they rode through town, Abigail noticed Hargrove emerging from the hotel, heading purposefully toward the telegraph office. He's sending word to Sullivan now, she observed. We don't have much time. We have enough, Silas assured her, though his grip on the reins tightened. Rebecca sent word that her father is insisting on seeing us again. Says it's urgent. Then we'll stop there first, Abigail decided. Crawford may be our unlikely ally in this fight. Emmett Crawford looked diminished in his sickbed, his once commanding presence reduced by illness. Yet his eyes burned with determination as Silas and Abigail entered his room. Rebecca sat beside him, holding a slate on which Crawford had painstakingly written messages with his functioning left hand, a method for clearer communication than his impaired speech. Thank you for coming, Crawford managed, gesturing to the slate. Rebecca held it up, revealing his carefully printed message. Sullivan sending men. Dangerous. We know, Abigail said. His lawyer Hargrove is already in town. He offered me money to leave and admit wrongdoing. Crawford's mouth twisted in what might have been a grimace or a smile. He scribbled on the slate, not just lawyer, hired guns. Silas and Abigail exchanged alarmed glances. Are you certain? Silas asked. Crawford nodded emphatically, writing again. Winters told me. 3 men coming. Tomorrow's stage. Your housekeeper was working for Sullivan? Abigail asked. Another nod. Years. My fault. Gave her reason. What can we do? Rebecca asked, fear evident in her voice. If they're coming to harm Abigail. Crawford's hands shook with effort as he wrote a longer message. Bank vault. Proof of foster claim. Original deed. Witnesses' signatures. Will help you. Why are you helping us now? Silas asked directly. The banker's gaze dropped momentarily, then rose to meet Silas's, unflinching despite his physical weakness. He wrote slowly, tired of bitterness. James wouldn't want this. Make it right. The land is rightfully Abigail's, Rebecca explained. Father wants to acknowledge that before... She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. I don't want to take Silas's home, Abigail protested. That was never my intention. Crawford shook his head, writing, not about taking, about truth. Legal claim equals protection. Sullivan can't touch territorial property rights. Understanding dawned on Silas. If Abigail's claim to the land is legally established, Sullivan has no power over it or her here in the territory. A federal land claim trumps private vendetta, Rebecca confirmed. Father's attorneys confirmed it this morning. Crawford wrote again. Go to bank, safe deposit box 17, my authorization. He held out a key and a folded paper which Rebecca explained was his written authorization for the bank manager. Hurry, he added aloud, the effort costing him visibly. Not much time. As they prepared to leave, Crawford gestured weakly for Abigail to come closer. When she bent near, he grasped her hand with surprising strength. Forgive, old fool, he whispered. Your father was right. Always right. Tears pricked Abigail's eyes at this unexpected admission. Thank you, she said simply. Crawford nodded once, then closed his eyes, exhausted by the encounter. Rebecca walked them to the door. The attorney is drawing up documents acknowledging your claim and transferring the deed, she explained. Father insists on making this right while he still can. We don't want to take advantage of his condition, Silas said. You're not, Rebecca assured them. For the first time in 20 years, my father is thinking clearly. Please let him do this. Outside, snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting lazily from a steel-gray sky. Silas helped Abigail into the wagon, both of them quiet with the weight of Crawford's revelations and the looming threat from Sullivan's men. "To the bank, then?" Silas asked as he took the reins. Abigail nodded, determination setting her features. "To the bank. Then to Miller's office with whatever we find. And then we prepare to fight for our home," Silas finished grimly. "All of us, together." The Evergreen Valley Bank stood imposingly at the town's center, its stone facade and columns projecting stability and permanence. Inside, the high ceilings and polished counters continued the illusion of grandeur, though the building was barely 10 years old. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, received them with obvious discomfort. News of Crawford's condition had spread, creating uncertainty about the bank's leadership. When Silas presented Crawford's authorization, Peterson examined it suspiciously. "This was signed today?" he questioned, studying the shaky signature. "Mr. Crawford is ill but lucid," Rebecca explained firmly. "As his daughter, I can verify the authorization is genuine." Peterson hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Follow me to the safe deposit vault." The vault stood at the rear of the bank, an impressive iron door separating it from the main floor. Peterson worked the combination methodically, then swung the heavy door open with practiced ease. Inside, numbered boxes lined the walls. "Box 17, Peterson said, locating it halfway up one wall. "I'll need the key." Silas handed over Crawford's key. The manager inserted it along with his own master key, turning both simultaneously. The box slid out smoothly. "I'll leave you to your business," Peterson said stiffly. "Ring the bell when you're finished." He retreated, closing the vault door, but leaving it unlocked as bank policy required when customers were inside. The metal box contained several document folders, each neatly labeled. Rebecca found the one marked Foster Claim and opened it reverently. Inside lay the original deed to the land, dated 1854 and bearing William Foster's signature. Attached was the subsequent sale agreement to Crawford, with the crucial clause highlighted. In consideration of circumstances surrounding this sale, seller reserves for himself and his heirs the right of first refusal should buyer ever sell or transfer any portion of said lands. This right shall remain in perpetuity and constitutes a binding covenant on the land itself. Additionally, the folder contained affidavits from witnesses to the agreement, survey maps of the original claim, and most surprisingly, a letter from William Foster to his daughter, sealed but never sent. With trembling fingers, Abigail broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed paper. Her father's familiar handwriting brought an immediate lump to her throat. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, I have passed on without the chance to explain certain matters to you in person. Chief among these is the land claim in Evergreen Valley, Colorado Territory. This investment was to be your inheritance, my attempt to secure your future even as our fortunes declined in Philadelphia. The sale to Emmett Crawford was necessary for our immediate survival, but I insisted on the right of first refusal clause to protect your interests. Should circumstances ever bring you to Evergreen Valley, know that you have legal claim to this land should Crawford or his heirs attempt to sell it. I regret many things as I write this, but I regret nothing done from principle. Remember always that the true measure of our worth is not in the acclaim we receive, but in the integrity with which we face our choices. With all my love, your father." Tears flowed freely down Abigail's cheeks as she passed the letter to Silas. He read it silently, then folded it carefully and returned it to her. "He never stopped thinking of your future," he said softly. "Even when he had nothing left to give," Abigail agreed, wiping her eyes. Rebecca, who had been reviewing the other documents, looked up with sudden excitement. "This changes everything," she said. "With these papers and Father's written acknowledgement of your claim, Sullivan has no legal recourse. Even his political connections can't override territorial property law." "We need to get these to Miller immediately," Silas said. "He's waiting with the attorney to draw up the formal recognition of Abigail's claim." They carefully returned the other documents to the box, but took the Foster folder with them. As they emerged from the vault, Peterson approached anxiously. "Is everything satisfactory?" he asked. "Perfectly," Rebecca assured him. "Thank you for your assistance." As they exited the bank, none of them noticed Hargrove watching from across the street, his expression calculating. The lawyer pulled his coat tighter against the cold and hurried toward the telegraph office once more. Dr. Miller's office was warm and welcoming after the chill outside. The physician had cleared his examination room for their impromptu legal meeting. Mr. Whitaker, the town's only attorney, sat at Miller's desk, surrounded by legal papers. "You found them," Miller said as they entered, relief evident in his voice. "Everything we need," Rebecca confirmed, presenting the foster folder. "The original deed, the sale agreement with the first refusal clause, and witness affidavits." Whitaker, a balding man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, examined the documents with professional interest. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The clause is quite explicit. Any sale of the land without offering Miss Foster first opportunity to purchase constitutes a breach of contract." "Which means," Silas prompted. "Which means," Whitaker explained, "that technically, your purchase of the parcel from Crawford was invalid. The land should have been offered to Miss Foster first." Silas's face fell. "So my deed is worthless?" "Not necessarily," Whitaker said thoughtfully. "There are several legal remedies available. The simplest would be for Miss Foster to formally transfer her right of first refusal to you, retroactively validating your purchase. Or, Miller suggested, given your personal relationship, a joint claim might be most appropriate." Abigail and Silas exchanged glances. "Joint claim?" Abigail asked. "As husband and wife," Miller clarified with a small smile. "I believe that was proposed yesterday at the church meeting?" A flush colored Abigail's cheeks. "It was, but we haven't had time to properly discuss it," Silas finished, taking her hand. "Though my proposal stands." Whitaker cleared his throat diplomatically. "Whatever you decide, we should formalize Miss Foster's claim immediately. Sullivan's representatives could arrive any day, and establish territorial property rights will be your strongest protection." "Sooner than that," Miller said grimly. "A telegram arrived while you were at the bank. 3 men arrived on the early stage, rough-looking characters asking about a foster woman at the hotel." Rebecca gasped softly. "Sullivan's hired guns." "Then we need to move quickly," Silas said decisively. "Mr. Whitaker, prepare whatever documents are needed to establish Abigail's claim." "And our marriage certificate," Abigail added quietly, squeezing Silas's hand. "If you're still certain." The surprise and joy that illuminated Silas's face was answer enough. "Never been more certain of anything," he said softly. For the next hour, Whitaker drafted the necessary legal documents, while Miller sent discreet messages to trusted townsfolk. As word spread of Sullivan's threatened violence against one of their own, for Abigail had become that through her months of service, the community began to mobilize. Ezekiel Blackwood arrived with 4 of his ranch hands, all armed. "Heard there might be trouble," he said simply. "Thought we'd lend a hand." Nathan hobbled in on crutches, determined to help despite his healing leg. "Miss Foster saved my leg," he declared stubbornly when his mother protested. "I'm staying." By mid-afternoon, Miller's office had become an impromptu headquarters. Maps of the town were spread across tables, defensive positions discussed, weapons checked. The 3 strangers had been spotted moving between the hotel, saloon, and general store, gathering information, assessing the terrain. "They'll make their move tonight or tomorrow morning," predicted Tom Jenkins, a former cavalry officer now farming outside town. "Likely try to catch you isolated, away from support." "Then we don't give them the chance," Silas replied. "We stay together, stay visible, and make sure they understand the entire town stands against them." As dusk approached on their wedding day, 2 days after the church confrontation, Reverend Parker arrived, slightly breathless from his hurried walk through the snow. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. "Is it true you wish to be married today?" Abigail, who had been reviewing the land documents with Whitaker, looked up in surprise. "Today? But we haven't prepared anything." "Sometimes circumstances dictate timing," Miller said pragmatically. "And a married woman with established property rights presents a much more formidable legal challenge than an unmarried nurse with questionable claims." Silas crossed to Abigail, taking both her hands in his. "It's not how I imagined asking you," he said softly. "No proper courtship, no time to plan. If you want to wait until this danger has passed, I'll understand." Abigail studied his face, the earnest eyes, the worry lines etched deeper by recent events, the steadfast devotion that had never wavered since he'd found her half frozen at the train station. In that moment, all doubts vanished. "We've faced everything else together," she said. "Why not this too?" A cheer went up from those gathered in the office. Reverend Parker beamed, opening his prayer book. Well then, shall we proceed? In the fading light of a winter afternoon with snow falling gently outside the windows and surrounded by newfound friends who had become family, Silas Thornton and Abigail Foster were married. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with quiet certainty against the backdrop of looming danger. As Reverend Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Silas drew Abigail into a tender kiss that promised protection, partnership, and a love that had blossomed against all odds. Mrs. Thornton, he whispered against her lips. Mr. Foster Thornton, she replied with a smile, causing laughter to ripple through the gathered witnesses. The celebration that followed was brief but joyous. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey, toasts were offered, and for a moment, the threat hanging over them receded. Then Jenkins, who had been watching through the window, stiffened. They're coming, he announced. All three of them, armed. The room fell silent, joy giving way to tension. Silas moved protectively to Abigail's side as Ezekiel and his men positioned themselves near the doors and windows. Let them come, Miller said calmly, picking up a shotgun from beside his desk. They'll find Evergreen Valley united against them. As boots crunched on the snowy boardwalk outside, Abigail stood tall beside her new husband, the deeds and marriage certificate clutched in one hand, his strong fingers intertwined with her other. Whatever came through that door, they would face it together, not just the two of them, but an entire community bound by care, principle, and the kind of love that builds rather than destroys. The door swung open and the final confrontation began. The three men who entered Miller's office were clearly professional troublemakers, hard-faced, heavily armed, and carrying themselves with the dangerous confidence of those accustomed to intimidation. Their leader, a tall man with a pockmarked face and cold gray eyes, surveyed the room with mild surprise at the assembled crowd. Seems we've interrupted a gathering, he drawled, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. We're looking for Abigail Foster. Judge Sullivan sends his regards. That's Foster Thornton now, Silas corrected firmly. My wife. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. Wife? Well now, that complicates matters. He touched the brim of his hat. Ma'am, congratulations on your nuptials. What do you want, mister? Ezekiel demanded from his position near the window. Burke, these are my associates, Delaney and Carter. The man's false civility didn't reach his calculating eyes. As I said, we're here representing Judge Edward Sullivan of Philadelphia. He has unfinished business with the lady. Any business with my wife concerns me, Silas stated, stepping forward, and apparently concerns half the town as well, as you can see. Burke glanced around at the armed men positioned strategically throughout the room. Quite the welcome committee. Word travels fast in small towns, Miller said dryly, echoing Hargrove's earlier observation to Abigail. Indeed. Burke's gaze settled on Abigail. The judge was most disturbed to hear you'd settled here, ma'am. He feels your departure from Philadelphia left certain matters unresolved. The only unresolved matter, Abigail replied steadily, was the truth about what happened at Mercy Hospital. I chose to save a child who could be saved rather than a dying man who couldn't. For that, Judge Sullivan destroyed my reputation and my father's before me. The judge sees it differently, Burke said with a shrug. Regardless, he's instructed us to escort you back to Philadelphia to face charges of professional misconduct. She's not going anywhere, Silas growled. Jenkins stepped forward, his military bearing evident. You have no jurisdiction here, Burke. No legal authority to remove Mrs. Thornton from territorial lands. We have this, Burke replied, producing an official-looking document. Signed by 3 Pennsylvania judges, including Sullivan himself. A warrant for the arrest and extradition of Abigail Foster on charges of criminal negligence resulting in death. Whitaker moved forward, adjusting his spectacles. May I? He asked, holding out his hand for the document. Burke hesitated, then passed it over with a confident smirk. The attorney examined it carefully before looking up. This warrant has no standing in Colorado territory, he declared. It lacks territorial judicial endorsement and federal approval for cross-jurisdictional enforcement. Burke's expression hardened. The judge assured us. The judge misled you, Whitaker interrupted firmly. Furthermore, Mrs. Thornton is now a legal property owner in this territory, with documented claims predating any alleged offenses in Philadelphia. He held up the foster documents. These establish her father's original ownership of significant lands in Evergreen Valley and her inherited rights. Under territorial statutes, she cannot be extradited while property disputes are pending. Confusion flickered across Burke's face, quickly replaced by suspicion. Property claims? Hargrove didn't mention any property. Because he didn't know, Rebecca said, stepping forward. My father, Emmett Crawford, has formally acknowledged the Foster family's prior claim and Mrs. Thornton's inheritance rights. She produced another document, her father's signed statement. This was filed with territorial authorities this afternoon. Burke and his men exchanged uneasy glances. This development clearly hadn't been part of their instructions. Additionally, Reverend Parker added from where he stood beside Miller, Mrs. Thornton is now a legally married resident of Evergreen Valley, with the full protection that status provides under territorial law. And the full protection of her neighbors, Ezekiel added meaningfully, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. Burke's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. What had seemed a straightforward intimidation job had become increasingly complicated. Sullivan had assured them the woman was isolated and vulnerable, easy to frighten into compliance. Instead, they faced a united community and unexpected legal obstacles. Perhaps, Burke said carefully, we should discuss this situation with Mr. Hargrove, clarify our position. A wise decision, Miller agreed. You'll find him at the hotel. I suggest you move along now. Burke's jaw tightened at the dismissal, but he recognized the precariousness of their position. Outnumbered and legally outmaneuvered, direct confrontation would be foolish. This isn't over, he warned, his gaze finding Abigail. The judge is a persistent man. So are we, UAD, Silas replied evenly, and we protect our own in Evergreen Valley. With a final measuring look, Burke gestured to his companions, and they withdrew, boots echoing on the wooden floor as they departed. A collective breath was released as the door closed behind them. They'll be back, Jenkins predicted grimly. Men like that don't give up easily. Perhaps, Miller acknowledged, but they'll find us just as resolved tomorrow as today. What happens now? Abigail asked, the tension of the confrontation leaving her slightly shaky. Now, Whitaker said, gathering the legal papers, I file these documents with the Territorial Land Office first thing tomorrow, establishing your claim beyond dispute. That will provide legal protection against Sullivan's machinations. And tonight, Ezekiel added, we keep watch. I'll have men near your cabin and the approaches to town. Those three won't try anything without reinforcements, but better safe than sorry. As the impromptu defense counsel continued their planning, Rebecca pulled Abigail aside. I should return to Father, she said. He'll want to know what happened. Of course, Abigail agreed. Please tell him. Tell him thank you. For everything. Rebecca smiled sadly. He's trying to make amends while he still can. 20 years of bitterness being undone in days. She squeezed Abigail's hand. Be careful, both of you. Men like Sullivan don't surrender easily. After final arrangements were made, Silas and Abigail prepared to return to their cabin, their home, now accompanied by Jenkins and two of Ezekiel's men as protection. Some wedding day, Silas murmured as he helped Abigail into their wagon. She smiled up at him, tired but resolute. Actually, I think it was perfect. Surrounded by friends, standing together against adversity. Isn't that what marriage truly means? Silas's expression softened as he gazed at his new wife, marveling at her strength. You're extraordinary, Abigail Foster Thornton. And you're stuck with me now, she replied lightly, though her eyes shone with deeper emotion. As they rode through the falling snow toward their cabin, the armed men following at a discreet distance, Abigail reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her here. From the lowest point of her life, freezing and alone at a remote train station, to this moment of belonging and purpose. Whatever challenges Sullivan might still bring, she faced them not as an isolated individual, but as part of something larger. A marriage, a community, a legacy of principle worth upholding. Behind them, the lights of Evergreen Valley twinkled through the snowfall, a constellation of warmth against the winter darkness. Ahead lay their cabin, humble but holding all they needed. And between them, their clasped hands promised a future built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and love that had bloomed like those rare flowers that only emerge after the harshest winters. Hope, indeed, amid the snow. 1 year later, spring sunshine bathed the valley in golden light as children played in the yard of the newly constructed Thornton Clinic. What had begun as a corner in a small cabin had grown into a proper medical facility serving the entire region. Above the door hung a simple wooden sign, lovingly carved by Silas, Foster Thornton Clinic, all welcome. Inside, Abigail tended to a young mother and her newborn, while Silas organized the medicine shelves. The cabin still stood behind the clinic, expanded now, with a new room added for the orphaned boy they'd taken in after winter's hardships. News had reached them last week of Judge Sullivan's declining health. His vendetta against the Fosters had faded as his own mortality demanded attention. The hired men had long since departed, never to return. The territorial governor himself had validated Abigail's land claim, making it impervious to outside challenges. At the edge of town, a small chapel now stood where James Crawford had lost his life in the mine. Rebecca had overseen its construction, fulfilling her father's wish in a way that brought healing rather than bitterness. Emmett Crawford, though still partially paralyzed, had found purpose in advising the bank's new management and reconciling with his past. As evening approached, Silas and Abigail walked hand in hand to the hilltop where two grave markers stood beside a thriving apple tree. They had planted a garden there, wildflowers now blooming in vibrant colors around Eleanor and Grace's final resting place. "They would be proud of what we've built," Abigail said softly. Silas nodded, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Not just a home or a clinic, a life worth living." They stood together watching the sunset over Evergreen Valley. No longer strangers to each other or the land, but stewards of a legacy built on compassion, courage, and the enduring power of hope that emerges even through the deepest snow.